so this is important, based on the data so far, and we've included Falcon 9 tests. So Falcon 9 was the original SpaceX rocket. And by the way, there were many years where those were failing. And now we're used to them landing 100% of the time because it's been, almost 10 years since they started developing it. And now they have a 99 point something success rate. They land every single time perfectly. But there was a learning curve at the beginning of Falcon 9. And we basically used that data and in unison with the SpaceX, the Starship test data so far. And we built a Monte Carlo that hazards a guess that there's only a 30% chance of them making the Mars window next year. That being said, we've just had a string of failures. And as a result, that model's probably skewed towards those failures.
I think the idea that Starship isn't really capable or close to launching V3 is definitely a bit overblown if you're watching Starship and SpaceX closely. What you realize is they're putting a lot of time and effort into reusability and landing of a Starship, which if you actually run the numbers out, reusability of Starship booster is kind of already proven to some extent. Obviously, we need to be optimized for reuse and all that stuff long term for 20 reuses, so on and so forth. But the Starship itself is much less important to the margin that Starlink creates.
One thing that I think is quite interesting about the whole Elon-Trump fight relative to space is that Trump and a lot of people who are worried about the effect of this on Elon's space business don't take into account that there isn't anyone that's really close. There's no one else for the US to really rely on the same level in terms of upmass, in terms of the cost of getting to space. Literally no one is close yet. And there are people who we're starting to believe will come close soon, but that's going to take years.
Okay, so Aaron Burnett, founder and CEO of Mark 33, and Vlad Saigau are with me for an exclusive look at the SpaceX valuation model that they built along with ARK Invest, and also a face that's quite familiar for my audience here on Over the Horizon. Gustav Anderson is a hand surgeon and associate professor of anatomy in northern Sweden. Welcome, gentlemen. Great to have you all with me today. We've got some important matters to discuss. $2.5 trillion. How did you get to that? Can you just briefly explain how you designed this valuation model? And more importantly, for the wider audience that may not be that financially clued in, what were the known unknowns and unknown unknowns in this case?
Yeah, so I'll jump in and I'll take some of that, and then I'll let Vlad take some of that as well. I think it's helpful to understand the context for why we even did this. Mach 33, we're a research-led asset manager, so we similar to like an ARK Invest or some of these others, we dive into these things and we try to understand, from smarter people than ourselves, what's going on with companies and look for opportunities and then make investments. So we do tend to put our money where our mouth is with that. In the initial kind of phase and building this out, we've been doing our own modeling on SpaceX since about a year ago, when we started doing really deep modeling on it. We approached ARK and said, hey, you guys are pretty good at doing these Tesla models and other open source models. I think it makes sense for us to work together on this. We can bring maybe kind of the depth on the space focus, because we do have a lot of focus on space. And you guys can help us kind of think through maybe some of the macroeconomic things that they're just much better at than we are. And I think ARK gets a lot of credit for just thinking through that and seeing that kind of what this could be, and partnering with someone, like ourselves. So the approach really, when you're trying to forecast from a high level, understand what's going on, when you're looking at SpaceX, you need to understand the core revenues. You need to try and forecast where those are headed. And you need to try and do this with years in advance, and really try to understand what the variability is. And so at the kind of the center of this model is understanding where the core revenues are, and that's Starship, that's launches, that's things like hardware intensive things with relatively low margin. And on the other side, which is really ends up being about 90% of the driver, is the Starlink revenue side of things, and that's consumer. There's Starshield and those as well. But we basically split up the model into two core kind of forecasts. There's like this 2030 forecast, which is a 5-year forecast. And there's a lot more certainty there because we have a sense of where things are, the growth from Starlink and others are headed. And then we did a more like a 15-year forecast looking out into the 2040 range. And that's a little bit more Mars oriented. So that was an important piece for us, is like try to take a first stab from a professional investment perspective at modeling the value of Mars. And it's not easy. We're certainly some version of wrong. We'd love it to be, directionally accurate and as accurate as possible. I'd be as surprised as everyone that's reading that or listening to this if we were correct in 2040 and we hit it right in the nail on the head. I'd be very surprised. Having said that, we wanted to make sure that we took that stab. But maybe you have some questions I can pass over to Vlad for maybe a bit deeper dive on some of the variables.
Yeah, but just I'm curious to know, how do you account for the unknown unknowns? Because there's two parts to this, really, two planets, so to speak. Two planets where everything SpaceX and Starlink right now is part of SpaceX, right? We're expecting Starlink to be spun out, an IPO maybe a year or 2 years down. That will be the cash cow or the flywheel that will then generate that crazy revenue to get SpaceX to where it needs to be to occupy Mars. So how do you kind of take into account the technological challenges? Because that's a big part of the unknown unknowns.
So I think it would be good if I take this one. And first thing I'll say is that with the 2030 valuation, which was the 2.5 trillion you mentioned, there's far fewer unknowns, because a lot of the inputs that go into that valuation, they already exist. So it's the number of satellites, the specs of those satellites, what the demand is for satellite internet, the number of launches, the specifications of the rockets, what are the unit economics of launching a kilogram to space, and how does that evolve through 2030? All of those things we have historical data on. So that 2030 2.5 trillion, we're pretty certain that that's the right ballpark. I would say that, between 1 trillion and 4 trillion, we're pretty 75% sure, 80% sure it will land there by 2030. The Mars side is a lot more interesting. So you're right.
So hang on. Let me just clarify them. Sorry to jump in, but when you talk about 2030, are you at all factoring, let's say, Starlink for Mars?
Well, not Starlink for Mars, because there won't be enough people to generate enough revenue on Mars. I'm sure there would be Starlink on Mars eventually, but in 2030, no. There is some Mars revenue, and in 2030, well, book value, because it's not revenue yet, in 2030. But in 2030, we're still in the very early stages. So
right.
The SpaceX economics haven't started compounding yet at that point. So
it's mostly book value. That's 2.5 trillion. That's your base case, right?
Other way around. So in 2030, most of that is because of Starlink revenue, but a tiny bit of Mars book value is there purely because they've done test launches and they will be sending the initial, whatever it is, settlers, colonizers, whatever you want to call them, the initial infrastructure will have begun to be set up in 2030. So I actually don't know if you have the chart from our blog. You just had one up, but this is effectively, so a Monte Carlo model. What that does is you set up a financial model and you make sure that the accounting is tight, that all the dollars are going where they're meant to be going, that all the assets are accounted for, whether that's rockets, satellites. But then what the beauty of the Monte Carlo is that you can have a set number of variables that you can say, hey, I don't know where this is going to land. So I don't know, for example, what year does Starship become reusable? What year does it become commercially viable? In 2030, how many of SpaceX launches are going to be dedicated to launching satellites versus launching other people's payloads? There are all these variables that we don't know, but we can hazard a guess. And so what we do is with a Monte Carlo is we pick ranges of what that variable could be, a minimum and a maximum. And we pick a statistical distribution that would make most sense, that would represent the outcomes within that variable. and then you have 20 or so of those variables that you're just not sure about. And what you do with a Monte Carlo is you then run a simulation where every single time you run a simulation, it picks randomly from those distributions and it spits out what the numbers would be. And you run those thousands and thousands and thousands of times over. And once you've done that, all of the outputs that come out effectively represent all the unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So if you look here, on the chart you have here, the blue curve is effectively a probability distribution of what we think the value of SpaceX will be in 2030. Now, if you click, you see where there's the blue dot, 2030 versus 2040. If you hit that, that's including Mars in 2040. So just ignoring the numbers, if you look at that, the curve is shaped completely differently. Why? Because the left one, we have a lot more certainty. So all of the outcomes, even given our unknowns, all of the outcomes are concentrated at a certain value. While in Mars, because there are so many more unknowns, the distribution's a lot wider. So all the outcomes are spread out. And the simulation is basically showing us that, yeah, there are more unknowns in 2040. So short answer to what you were saying before is that the Monte Carlo simulation, so long as we create a model that is logically tight, the Monte Carlo simulations handle the unknowns to an extent. So the shape of that curve, how you saw how it was a lot wider, that effectively shows us what we actually are uncertain about. Because if we were more certain, that curve would have been sharp, just as the 2031.
Yeah.
And it's worth, I'll just interject here real quick. It's worth noting that that model is downloadable from our site, ArcSite. You can get the same model in both places.
Right.
And then you can play with those variables. We created fairly wide ranges on these variables. Certain things I think are far too conservative, like how, when are we launching Starship commercially? I think we said as late as 2028. Like that seems way too long considering where we're at today and, and all that. But functionally, I would say we're even more conservative on these ranges, but picking a distribution within those ranges is how you get a sense of, okay, that's why we say 2.5 trillion. That 2.5 trillion falls at the 50% confidence mark in your 2030 distribution. And so in theory, 50% odds that it's 2.5 or larger, 50% odds that it's 2.5 or smaller. And then what Vlad was referencing earlier is that 1 point, I think it's 1.7, I forget the 25%, but like there's like a 75% interval that it falls between this 1 point something and 3 point something. And that's really how you get a pretty good sense of where the numbers are landing. There's still a non-zero chance that, we've got some variable range that's off, but we try to create a fairly wide range for these and not create anything too much off. But people can go in and they can change those assumptions. That's the beauty of an open source model. You can say we're wrong for
there's a lot
X,
of
Y, or Z
transparency
assumption.
built in, and but a lot of that really depends on a successful Starship, because without a successful Starship, you're not launching the Gen 3 satellites of Starlink, right? You're not going to be able to take payload either to space or to Mars. And right now, that's we're hoping that we get a reusable, at least one launch where we see Starship caught by Mechazilla by the end of this year. 2026 is when Elon has said that he's kind of targeting the first launches to Mars, right? Do you think, looking at the cadence of testing and the cadence of evolution and the problems we're seeing with Starship, the booster is more or less I would say about 60 to 70% locked down. There will be iterations, there will be changes in the size, the length, etc. But how do you see that uncertainty? Do you see where would you put the chances of the first launches to Mars being at the end of 2026?
So what's great is that we put a piece of analysis together just on this last week or the week before that, right after there was the anomaly on the pad when it was a test fire and the Starship blew up on the pad. And after that, everyone was saying they're not going to make it. There's no chance. This is 3 failures in a row. And so we actually built a Monte Carlo for that as well. Now, it was whipped up very quickly, and so it was only the first edition. We're going to build on it. But that Monte Carlo said that there's based on, so this is important, based on the data so far, and we've included Falcon 9 tests. So Falcon 9 was the original SpaceX rocket. And by the way, there were many years where those were failing. And now we're used to them landing 100% of the time because it's been, what, almost 10 years since they started developing them. And now they have a 99 point something success rate. They land every single time perfectly. But there was a learning curve at the beginning of Falcon 9. And we basically use that data and in unison with the SpaceX, the Starship test data so far. And we built a Monte Carlo that hazards a guess that there's only a 30% chance of them making the Mars window next year. That being said, we've just had a string of failures. And as a result, that model is probably skewed towards those failures. Say they crack something, we don't know what they're going to fix and what they're going to improve. We only know the historical success and failure rate. Say they have a success next, that might start skewing the model up higher. So the more data points we have and the more tests they do will inform that probability. But right now, based on what we know, we reckon it's about 30%, so less than a coin flip that they make it in 26. And one more caveat to that is I don't think it makes a big difference to the big picture. I mean, we're talking decades here, and
True.
if they don't make 26, they'll make 28. And and the beauty of this is this whole time.
I'll interject here, Vlad. We put that number out, and I think it's worth noting that all the anti-Elon crowd was very, very upset that we said anything above 0. And I had a number of people that said they would take those odds, or 0% against however much what our percentage was. And one of the other things that we don't really factor into this is there is an Elon urgency thing, right? Like a variable. When he really drives urgency in his businesses, you can see that. This is in his book that was out.
And when he's not
this
busy,
happens
when he's not busy fighting with Trump.
Yeah, exactly. So that's not really factored into this. All of those metrics could improve if there was an urgency
so then
overlay.
How do you account for a fallout between the Trump administration and Elon? Is that, are you perhaps thinking about factoring that in as a risk?
I don't know, Vlad, did you have anything in that? I don't think we did.
I think my initial thought on that is that risk will be reflected in the future test cadence. So the risk that it would be maybe regulatory. So the regulators would say, you can't test again.
The FTC could very easily just slow things down.
Right. And if that happens, that will show up in the data pretty quickly. Because that model that we built takes into account the turnaround time between tests. So it definitely is a risk. That being said, one thing that I think is quite interesting about the whole Elon-Trump fight relative to space is that Trump and a lot of people who are worried about the effects of this on Elon's space business don't take into account that there isn't anyone that's really close. There's no one else for the US to really rely on the same level in terms of upmass, in terms of the cost of getting to space. Literally no one is close yet. And there are people who we're starting to believe will come close soon, but that's going to take years. So I'm not that worried about it.
True.
Yeah, I would echo that. That.
But I mean, to be realistic, the more mishaps you have, and you've already seen Mexican government making noises about, doing their own independent investigations of the debris fields, etc. Do you think there is a possibility of reaching a point somewhere along the line from now to the end of 2026 where we're expecting the first launches, that if things go awry, that you might have to add in a few risk factors?
You're talking about into this Monte Carlo for the odds of hitting 2026. I think obviously people can go check out the variables, fairly exhaustive variables that play into each other. Pretty much all of them compound negatively pretty quickly. And so my gut says there's maybe a variable or two that's missing, but I doubt that it's something that's not captured in this.
Okay, so it's acknowledged in everything that you've modeled out.
Yeah, I think it's acknowledged in the turnaround time between tests. And in fact, there is an actual regulation variable where it says, hey, after each failure, what is the time that they're even allowed to start planning a new test? So that is a variable in there. And we're looking to improve the model. So I encourage people to look and if they have suggestions.
Okay, so Starlink is the cash cow. If there's a delay in Starship, you won't get enough of the Starlink Gen 3 sats up in orbit. You would not reach the TAM that would be ideal to be a precursor for an IPO. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say that the when you're looking at the big chunk of that model where you're have a ton of bandwidth down to orbit, we saw a chart earlier where the bandwidth was just going up. If you're going to need V3 to get to that because it's an order of magnitude increase in bandwidth per satellite. I want to say maybe 20x per launch, something like that. And so what you're looking at is definitely needing to. You do need V3 for that. I think the idea that Starship isn't really capable or close to launching V3 is definitely a bit overblown. If you're watching Starship and SpaceX closely, what you realize is they're putting a lot of time and effort into reusability and landing of a Starship, which if you actually run the numbers out, reusability of Starship booster is kind of already proven to some extent. Obviously, we need to be optimized for reuse and all that stuff long term for 20 reuses, so on and so forth. But the Starship itself is much less important to the margin that Starlink creates. And so, if you're looking at like, can they get into orbit? Can they do this? Can they release Starlinks and things like that? If that was their goal, I feel confident we'd already be there. If that was their primary goal, they are clearly trying to optimize towards Mars, towards being able to land on our planet and then hopefully another planet. Like, you don't need heat tiles if all you really care about is getting V3s in orbit. So it comes back to like, do you think they can do that because of their Falcon 9 experience? I really think this is, I don't want to overstate this, but it's relatively trivial compared to the bigger problem they're trying to solve. And that's a historical pattern with Elon businesses. They try and solve a problem that no one else in the world's even thinking about or even cares about. And all of these downstreams of benefits that come out of it are really interesting. And that's one of the reasons why it's such an interesting business and such a opportunity for being effectively bathed in bandwidth, because why else would you build a Starship other than going to Mars? But now you have the ability to launch these massive vehicles. The volume, the size of these vehicles is for V3 satellites is much bigger. You have the ability to have so much more bandwidth. Like, these are like knock-on effects of going to Mars, not they did this for Starlink. And so I think that's the way I think about it.
And just one final detail about that is that I reckon, as Aaron was saying, Starship clearly can get to orbit. The V1 Starship did it multiple times. And so if they were really desperate to make as much money as possible.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question to you. Could they just send up these Starships, fix that bay door mechanism, and just, kind of let it burn up in the atmosphere when it re-enters?
Well, the fact that they haven't done that, they could do that. So that the actual Starship could be expendable, and they would make a lot of money doing that with the V3s because, okay, one Starship going up is expensive. It's a rocket. Obviously, rockets are expensive. You'd want to reuse them. If you can't, that's like $100 million you've just spent like that. Mm-hmm. But if you're launching 60 of these V3 satellites that will be up there for 5 years, and they're already built, the cost of keeping them kept up is minimal, and they're generating revenue constantly 24 hours a day for 5 years. The money that you make off of that absolutely dwarfs the cost of launching that one Starship. And so what that should show people listening is that he's not optimizing for making as much money as possible. In fact, Starlink already makes enough money with the V2 satellites up there. They're going to make 15 billion in revenue this year. And, designing Starships is obviously hard. It's expensive, but he has the team. He has the infrastructure. He doesn't need more money to finish Starship off. And clearly his priority is perfecting this next vehicle because of the larger vision, which is Mars for him. So I think, to go back to your original question, there could be delays. And all that will do is push back the numbers that we have by a couple of years. But that compounding engine, that will take off eventually. as soon as
Right.
Starship is proven reliable.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so two very quick questions about the use cases and the markets. And Gustav is in Sweden. There's in Europe you have a whole different set of factors in the addressable market. There's competition also that's coming up from like OneWeb and Project Kuiper. The Chinese are launching, or at least planning to launch, a whole constellation of their own. I think one of their first rockets will be going up towards the end of this year with a bunch of satellites. How do you see the market expanding? Do you see any particular use cases where the low latency, high speed Starlink internet connections could kind of open up new use cases and new kind of markets where, or that perhaps have not been accounted for? Because you can innovate a lot if you've got the infrastructure, the communications infrastructure in place.
Yeah, there are several different things. Yeah, I'll hit some of the big ones. Starshield is one that gets that can be a disproportionately large percentage of the Starlink revenue, like larger than what you might think. Not as big as consumer broadband, but consumer broadband meaning home internet with a terminal.
Do you think Starshield will remain under SpaceX, or will it be part of Starlink if it's spun out because of its sensitive nature?
Yeah, it's hard to know, to be honest.
Okay.
It is fairly integrated and reliant on the networking capability that Starlink has and provides. So the idea that they might have a separate constellation specifically for that, and they might keep it in SpaceX if they were to spin out Starlink. It's not insane, but we're all just conjecturing at this point, and it's really hard to know. But it is a significant potential revenue source, and we underestimated it several months back, and we've started to be a bit more bullish on that, given where things are headed, and just the capability of having connection to remote places becomes a lot more, and with a lot of security on your networks becomes a lot more relevant to a customer, a defense customer, or government customer, where they will actually pay probably a higher kind of premium to be able to keep isolated networks, to ensure a certain amount of bandwidth and things like that. That's one of them. The other one is direct to cell, which is already kind of thought through with like T-Mobile and what these guys are doing. There's a lot of questions about what does that actually look like? Is it just a backup service or what have you? This is one of the things that we needed to have kind of fall under the umbrella of the Monte Carlo simulations, because there's just too much variability going on there. And one thing I would mention is we touched on the competition, the Kuipers, the OneWebs. This is going to happen, of course, but it's really hard to get the capability that Starlink has. And I think the biggest competitive advantage and moat that they have is really the ability to have manufacturing scale in 3 areas. That is all independently very difficult, but you combine those together and it's quite an advantage. So they have the ability to build launch vehicles at a scale that very, very difficult. This isn't millions of units a year, but being able to do just the number of boosters and things they've proven with Falcon 9 and even early with Starship is just incredible. They have the ability to do the terminals with the end user terminals at millions in a year. That's another scale point that is, going to be hard to replicate. And then they have the ability to do the satellites themselves at thousands a year or more. And these are not trivial machines to build. So you combine all 3 of those things, and it's very difficult to see someone else catch up at the scale. I'm sure there will be peripheral niche kind of markets where maybe a OneWeb dominates, or certain regional requirements. This government wants this company because of X, Y, or Z. There will be some competitive things, but the idea that Kuiper just got their second launch into orbit, to scale up to tens of thousands of satellites and tens of millions of terminals that are up to speed and all that stuff. Yes, they have the capability. Will they be there eventually? Yes. What does that look like? Is that 5 years from now? Is that towards the tail end of 5 years where there's really starts to be more competition? That's where I think about the competitive side of things.
Yeah. How do you view Chinese competition?
It's a good one. I'm going to pass that over to Vlad because they've been thinking a bit about this on the Belt and Road side of things.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. I think, as Aaron was saying, everyone is just far behind. So everyone is years behind. So China, they will catch up, I'm sure, eventually. And when they do, I'm sure there will be customers or use cases that prefer to use the Chinese constellation. And there are probably many reasons that they're creating that constellation, probably for security, redundancy, so that they don't have services or people within their scope of interest that are relying on a US company or a US corporation. So they definitely have their incentives to do that, and they will. Orders of magnitude behind right now in terms of assets up in space or rockets being launched. And, you know, we'll just have to see how that shakes out over the coming years. I think what's interesting is that SpaceX launches 90% of up mass, so all the kilograms that go to space a year, they launch 90% of that, and that's including and growing. And China is included in that. So China's the second number after that.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the US companies are a little slice, and then Europe's a little slice. And so one thing to think about is, of that 90%, SpaceX chooses to use 70% of all its launch capacity on Starlink. So even if other people caught up, say, you know, other companies that are building their own satellites, how are they going to launch them? Because there is a limited supply. You know, they always have the head start in that. However much mass is going up into space a year, 90% of that is SpaceX, and 70% of that 90% is Starlink. So what we'll need to see is other launch vehicles coming around in order for people to not be dependent on SpaceX, or the whole global space economy to not be dependent on SpaceX as it is now. So I think that's going to be the first barrier to entry, seeing other launch vehicles. I think if there are other launch vehicles that are at scale, whether that's Blue Origin, whether that's China in and of itself, that will allow for more capacity to go up, and then maybe we'll see them catch up. But until that point, until that they have enough rockets, and those rockets are at least partially reusable, because fully reusable rockets, everyone can do that now. And I'm sorry, fully expendable rockets, everyone can do that now, but it's expensive. And every single time you launch one, you have to build another one. That takes a long time, and it takes a lot of money. And so to be able to, what SpaceX is doing now, launch a rocket and at least reuse part of it, we're getting kind of closer to the commercial aviation model where, you know, imagine if you could only fly on a plane once. The ticket would be extortionate, right? It'd be really, really expensive. But these things fly thousands of times in their lifetimes, multiple times a day. And Elon's applying that business model to rockets. And so there's the technological breakthrough that others will have to have in order to have their rockets reusable. And as soon as they have the technological breakthrough, they'll scale it up. And then I'm sure we'll see some catching up. Up until that happens, they're playing catch up.
So what would you say are the threats? Is it the lack of TAM potentially, or is it what the threat to this business model, or for it to grow this big valuation?
Yeah. I'm taking a second to make sure I have a list of them before I just start talking.
I'll jump in with from a high level while Vlad organizes his thoughts, maybe at the more detailed level. You know, we talked about some of them already, right? Which is regulatory, things like that can slow things down. I do think it's probably, you know, effectively going to be some of this TAM questions. That's why there's actually a second model that ARC did that actually models out the TAM, so you can really understand this stuff and get a sense of what the opportunities are. And you know, if you wanted to change a variable, it might change it from, you know, 180. I forget the top end number, billion, trillion. There's a big number up there. You know, maybe down to 120 and things like that. So like that's one thing you can play with and get a sense of that. I think one of the questions that comes down to this is there's like there's a couple of random externalities that could get kind of scary quickly. You know, I think something like a Kessler syndrome, like if you have a large, you know, like a defense, an adversary trying to create a cascading effect of satellites running into each other. That's a big global problem.
The Kessler effect. Yeah.
yeah, that kind of thing that's something that could really throw a wrench into a 40,000 satellite constellations plans. Having said that, I think that's pretty low risk. I think a lot of that's doomerism and kind of chaos headline chasing.
No, but that's
that
also
might focus on
a
that
real
stuff.
risk, right? When you consider the satellites in LEO as opposed to geosynchronous orbit that's further out, more difficult to target. I mean, it's not necessarily an active targeting by an enemy state. It could just very well be an asteroid or a meteoroid, or just or just another old satellite, kind of losing its orbit and then crashing into one, and then you have the cascading effect. So how do you factor that in?
Well,
if at
so
all?
we've done an entire analysis on this, and I know Vlad could go deep on that. But effectively, what this comes down to is there are people, states, companies actively looking at mitigation strategies around these things. Space is a lot bigger than we think it is. You would think about, like, when you think about the garbage patches on the ocean, and you've ever gone on a cruise line or whatever, you don't see them everywhere. They are big, they're there, but that's like one layer of this. And now imagine something that's much bigger and hundreds and thousands of kilometers of planes with which this can happen on. So it is bigger. These pictures that we see of like all the satellites in orbit, like they're nowhere near scale. So I'm not saying that it's a 0% problem, but if you start to factor in the sheer scale of LEO itself, the active mitigation strategies that are being deployed and opportunities, if we just start taking it seriously, then people will throw up lasers and different things that get relatively easy to deploy. You're looking at potentially millions of satellites that could be in orbit without any real concern. Yes, there could be a random meteorite that comes in and breaks up one satellite, but that's not like a sure thing. Like one satellite breaking up creates a problem. We had Russia recently blow up one of their own satellites. I believe it was a couple of years back. Like big doomerism headlines, but like, people have to, fly around these things, but it's not as, on the cusp of a big tragedy as most of the headlines would like to kind of like encourage us to think. So I think it's a risk. I don't know if it's sub 1%, but I would put it in that category of, problem.
And how hard would it?
Something like that.
And I mean, to renew all of them, they still have to renew the satellites regularly. So I guess it would just be a time before they have it all up there again.
I mean, if the Kessler syndrome. So first of all, let me just say caveat: I think the chances of Kessler syndrome happening is extremely low, mainly because of self-interest. I mean, we all rely on space. If Kessler syndrome happened, which is the satellites start hitting each other, and that creates more debris, which then hits more satellites, basically all of LEO would turn to dust, and you just have a shell, an impenetrable shell of randomly moving debris. That is a catastrophe. Like it is over for the world, and going into space, that's not happening anymore. But
which would open another business model for cleanup in space.
Yeah, if you can get a rocket up there without it getting shredded apart instantly. So I think
they'll just use lasers. I don't want to oversimplify it, but they'll just start using lasers. Like to me, this is a whole. It's just how bad of an issue there is. There's going to be some kind of event that gets people more scared. Is that 1 year from now? Is it 10 years from now? Is it 20 years from now? Something like that will cause a re-emphasis on regulation and like a speeding up of things that technologies that people are scared about because of the defense capabilities. If you have a laser pointing up, you can take anyone's satellite down, right? So, but like if there is a bigger problem, which is we got to take some of these large debris fields out, they'll start to just really accelerate those things. It's like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Star Wars, baby.
We have GPS up there. There are things that aren't just Starlink oriented that are very important, defense and all this other stuff. So there's a reason for the concern. It's just thinking of it as something that is going to be an externality that kills SpaceX's business or Starlink business. It's like global war. It might be in like line with those types of things, that an asteroid hitting us and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
To give people an idea, though, because there are numbers on this. So every day there are 200,000 conjunction warnings in the US alone. And what conjunction is a risk of to objects, whether that's a satellite or a bit of debris. So we track every bit of debris that's up in space right now, along with the satellites. There are 200,000 warnings a day about those conjunctions happening. And those conjunctions, they have a certain probability of happening. They're usually weeks in advance. So it'll be like, okay, if these things stay on the same path in 2 weeks' time, they might hit each other. You should probably do something about it. And Starlink, the constellation, which has 7,000 satellites, they do 300 maneuvers a day to avoid conjunctions.
Yeah.
So that's to give people some numbers. You might not know, but the Starlink satellites use AI collision avoidance. So a lot of the time, a lot of this is automated. And you can imagine the better AI gets and our data sets get and our tracking gets, the probability of collision goes down. So we spoke a lot about Kessler syndrome, which I think gives it too much weight, personally. I don't think it's a threat anytime soon.
I love your confidence. So what are the other kind of revenue streams from Mars to orbit on Starship? Are you looking, how
From
about
Mars?
things like, no, Earth orbit? How about things like manufacturing in space? The Starship would lend itself to a lot of different activities in space. Possibly even a configuration of Starships could replace the ISS post 2030, right? Have you taken those different models and revenue streams into account?
So
I mean, everything from biomedical, I mean, printing organs in space to space research, space habitat, everything.
You're very right about that. And those are super fascinating to us. So one thing to bear in mind here is maybe the cost of going to space. So back in the day, maybe, I don't know what the back in the day is, but it used to be roughly $20,000 to $50,000 a kilogram to go to space. And now Falcon 9 has brought that down to, let's say, $3,000 a kilogram. So that's 20 times, like an order of magnitude at least lower. Starship, even if it's fully expendable, even if you send it up and blow it up, it's $500 a kilogram. And that's because of just how big it is. There's economies of scale and physics scaling laws. I mean, the bigger the rocket is, the cheaper it is. Then if it becomes reusable, fully reusable, we're talking $20 a kilogram. So that's like me and you can afford to go to space for the cost of a transatlantic flight. And
and that
so
just opens up so many new use cases that we haven't thought about, right? Because then you have so many more, like millions could start innovating. You could have college students and school students just sending up little doves, and satellites and experiments, and that's a whole new economy that's kind of sparked because of Starship. How do you even begin to model all of that?
Well, we think that probably takes place in the 2030s once you have a reliable, reusable Starship. And for the purposes of our model.
Oh, really? Okay, so this is post 2030.
I think, yes, this is post 2030. Not only do you need Starship to be reusable consistently, but then you need to start. I mean, Elon wants to build hundreds of these a year. And so you need a lot of them. And so I think that's probably post 2030. We start seeing these use cases that many people who have been watching the space industry have been dreaming about, things like in-space manufacturing, in-space energy. There's all kinds of things. Right now, Aaron, I think, you would say we're more in an Earth observation phase. That's where a lot of the in-space applications are. But that will expand to stuff that, we've been dreaming about in the 2030s once costs come down.
I think the infrastructure kind of thought process makes sense here. You're talking, people have talked about point-to-point Starship, SpaceX and their team have talked about point-to-point themselves, meaning, Earth to Earth, fast trips to Japan or whatever. If you're doing that, there's a lot of infrastructure on the ground that needs to be built out. You need those little spaceports. So, definitely something they can do if they put their mind to something. They can effectively do anything, and they have the cash to throw at it. So it's not that they can't be done, but it's probably.
I'm sure you'd agree that the defense, vertical for earnings is more realistic than kind of this. than this earnings potential.
Over the next few years. That's kind of the whole Star Shield thing that they've been focusing on. It wouldn't surprise me at all that they'll do something around the point-to-point with the cargo. There are other companies doing that, earlier stage companies that are talking about doing some of those things. There's a combination of that. But when you talk about 2030 timeframe, you talk about the revenues associated with that, and based on what we're forecasting, it's like kind of a drop in the bucket. $1 billion contracts are big deals with defense. Happens all the time, but when you're talking about $1 billion contract in, compared to maybe 100 billion kind of thing, where those kind of numbers with telecoms, like it doesn't look all that significant. It's significant, it's important, it's but I do think 2030s are interesting for in space infrastructure. You could see like fuel, liquid oxygen is a very important fuel, and getting that from Earth to space is very hard. And if they're able to get it, large scales of that, you can see fuel depots, you can see a variety of other things, whether it's manufacturing facilities.
It's not just
or
communications as a service, but also transportation as a service. And really, this is like the infrastructure backbone for everything in LEO and beyond. Very quickly, I know we're short on time, and I'm wondering if you can spill over a bit onto your next, if it's possible. But I quickly want to talk to you about the potential. So you have India, which is one of the biggest telecom markets in the world, giving Starlink the license to operate, right? How do you see the play out? And to the best of, when I look over the horizon, a little plug for my channel, I don't see how terrestrial players can compete with Starlink, especially when you have Starlink, SpaceX bought over Swarm Technologies. There's a lot more innovation going on peer-to-peer sharing. When do you see that point, that crossover point, when it'll just become impossible for terrestrial service providers to compete with Starlink? I know it's a very politically incorrect and touchy subject, but still, have a go.
I think it's going to be a cost thing. So right now, because there's no one competing, one thing with Starlink, so let's talk about Starlink now. The prices of getting Starlink internet is a lot higher than your terrestrial broadband. And that's because they're just at the start of the capacity that they're launching up there. And because there's only so much capacity they can fill, they're going to sell that capacity to people who most need it. So people who who have more money and who live in rural areas, those are the ones that have Starlink now. What's going to happen over time is the more capacity they launch up, they'll need to fill that capacity with demand. And you're going to move up that demand curve, which effectively means you're selling to people who don't have as much money, but also want the service. And so prices come down. Over time, prices just keep going down, 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 down. And so there might be a point where SpaceX is making enough money, Starlink is making enough money, and the profit margins are good and healthy, and they might stop growing the constellation. And at that point, competitors could come in and undercut them in certain industries, whether or niches. Whether it's China launching a constellation and saying, "Hey, you should use the Chinese network because you live in China and you don't want to be relying on Elon. You want to rely on us." Whether it's, for example, AST Space Mobile is a very hot stock right now, and they're focusing purely on direct to cell. So direct to cell, by the way, if anyone who missed it the first time around, is when you get satellite internet straight to your phone. That's a niche in a way, because it's not as big a market.
I think Vodafone is tied up with the AST, right?
Vodafone, AT&T, Verizon, but yeah, over here in Europe, Vodafone. So Starlink is clearly not prioritizing direct to cell, and that's a whole other conversation. They're prioritizing broadband because I guess they can sell more bandwidth and they make more money selling broadband bandwidth, 100 megabit speeds versus to your phone, a couple megabit speeds. They're selling more bandwidth, so they make more money. So they're prioritizing the biggest cash cow. But there will be other players that will come in, whether those are nations, whether those are other corporations like AST Space Mobile that focus on specific niches that SpaceX aren't tackling. And they'll undercut them in other areas where they're not addressing it well enough. So I think it's a difficult conversation. Aaron, do you mind going into a bit about the historical precedent of certain industries where having a monopoly has actually made sense, and how historically that's panned out a couple times where we've had a monopoly in certain industries and it's now evolved into more competition, but for the initial decades they were a monopoly. Talking rail, oil.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about the Industrial Revolution.
The
I mean,
India company,
that kind of stuff is. Before we go there, though, briefly, I think it's important to say, like, it really isn't. Space-based internet is not a competition against fiber. Fiber really is better. It's got more bandwidth. It's got less latency. But where space-based stuff, space-based internet works is when fiber can't go there physically. Right? And that's why it takes forever for them to actually lay physical glass lines into the ground to then connect people that way. But if you were to just do apples and oranges, you will get more bandwidth, lower latency if you go with fiber. And so really where Starlink or any of these broadband constellations shine is that kind of that quote unquote last mile of, connecting everywhere else that doesn't have a fiber hub. And so that's where you see a lot of opportunity there. And there's arguments to be made about, the new rural real estate points where now all of a sudden, like, being connected anywhere, you're in the middle of a barren wasteland, you have all the internet you'll ever need. So that's kind of an important piece of this whole thing, is like understanding that when you compare it to current service providers. In theory, we could lay glass lines across every square inch of the landmass across the entire planet, and you would be better off because of the just the way the physics are. But the reality is, there's that's the reason there are 2 billion people unconnected to the internet today, because that build out takes time and takes a long time like that.
Here's the thing I want to add to that. Here's the thing I want to add to that, and consider this scenario, okay? And we were talking about it just a couple of days back here on the channel, because we were looking at Tesla's robotaxi launch in Austin, Texas, and the trickle down effect it will have on the way cities are designed, where people choose to live. So if you have access to autonomous vehicles, and you don't need to, you can concentrate on doing other stuff other than concentrating on the road and driving, while you're getting from point A to point B in comfort, in privacy, in safety. And the cost is so low that you perhaps wouldn't want to own a car anymore. People would choose to move out further from the central districts. You'd have people even moving to more rural areas. And then this whole question of not having this sufficient connectivity in rural areas, or not quality internet in rural areas, will then only grow. What if Elon were to launch a phone that would have XAI, Grok, Starlink connectivity, your robotaxi app, an entire ecosystem? Because if you look at the way Apple is looking at either Anthropic or OpenAI for their Siri, for their AI, I think Motorola's tied up with Perplexity. It just seems like a phone is going to be a device that is going to be a unifying device for all of Tesla's services, and then you could take that device anywhere in the world. So a lot changes for Starlink, doesn't it?
There's a lot of synergies between the Elon companies, and I think the question is not how would that affect Starlink, but how would Starlink affect that? Because you're right about robo-taxis, that's one. But as Aaron was just saying, that there isn't fiber broadband everywhere. But what if you can get fiber broadband speeds living in a rural area where the land costs 10 times less? And instead of spending it on a super expensive apartment, you spend your money on your dream house, and then you're connected to the grid via Starlink internet. Exactly. And then as you're saying, you could own your own car, or you can book a robo-taxi to pick you up whenever you need to go into the city, or hell, you could have your Tesla, go pick up your shopping.
And Amazon drones will get you whatever you want.
So yeah, it's actually super interesting that maybe right now the connectivity argument for Starlink, it seems on the surface level, maybe it's a bit weak. It's like, well, I live in a city. Why do I care about Starlink connectivity? And Aaron has mentioned this point before, but Starlink is a driver for deurbanization. So people moving out from city centers it's an enabler of that. So I think you're spot on, Roden.
And I just to, as we're closing here, one thing that I want to throw into it, you described, the full Elon Musk ecosystem all kind of connected. You may have just described, basically the technological connection backbone for Mars in that 2030 to 2040 timeframe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But, you need a few satellites up for them to get global. Yeah. Now you have a humanoid robot, like global connection. Like this is like a Starlink over Mars instantly gets fiber like, connection there. There's no need to lay fiber all over Mars. You have the ability to take a Optimus and let it, in theory, as long as it has the right charging points all the way across the planet to do reconnaissance for you, whatever the heck you wanted to do.
Yeah. So
that's kind of the ecosystem for Mars.
Exactly. It is. If you have time, just a very quick question, because it's a segue from what you said. If you look at Mars and all the earnings verticals, the revenue streams that come in, you've got transportation as a service, that's Starship. You've got communications infrastructure, that's Starlink. You've got Mars labor force, which is Optimus. You've got surface transport, which possibly would be a Mars version of a Cybertruck, right? Instead of, Mars is the only planet that's already colonized by bots. Just just to get this out there, and people need to start thinking about this as a reality of our existence today. So this isn't science fiction, right? And then you have the Boring Company, and the Boring Tunnel. They fit really snugly into a Starship right now, right? So you have human habitation that probably will be underground to begin with because of the threat from planetary, asteroids and meteoroids and all of that, and radiation and the extreme temperatures on Mars. And then you have megapacks, you've got solar, and as Brian Wang, who was on my channel a few days back, said, you probably have XAI data centers, and you probably have a whole new bunch of models for Earth trained on Mars, AI models. So when and how do you start factoring this into your model?
You mean the connection of all these things?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the question? Like, how do you? Well, then you're talking about a Muskonomy model, right? Where you have to connect all these points, and in that, if you want to think our model today is complex, the next iteration, where you're trying to connect the overlapping, valuation shares gets really complex. I don't know if we'll get to that at some point. Probably not for a couple of years.
I don't know
there's
when
more
that will be.
direct paths and no.
I don't know when that will be, but you've just described, I guess, what the goal is of my job. I think eventually that will be what it will evolve to, where we'll just be one unified model of, all of these companies. Right now, it was already a big enough job to model Mars and SpaceX, So
I can imagine.
Yeah.
And
by the way,
it's worth pointing out that the whole Mars value really was a book value, right? So like the idea is like, here's Optimus, here's how many we think we can go there. And then if you assume that they can reach a certain level of human productivity creates some kind of value, right? It's not just being done for something that has zero value. And so that was the very simplified logic that was like, that's where the book value of Mars starts to accrue over the next 15 years. And so with that in mind, I think that logic is one helpful way, kind of encapsulates all this stuff, right? There's value being created. They're not going there to waste time. So as that value creates, it kind of creates a general number. And that's when we got into the tens of trillions.
One final question,
potentially and beyond.
And you can kick this down the road if you don't want to address it. But what about the government model on Mars? Because you're going to have, that's going to factor into a lot of things. As long as you're lifting off mass from Earth and taking to Mars, is Elon going to be the Lord and the savior of Mars? The Emperor of Mars. What are the politics? It's the wild, wild west, isn't it? Really, you look at space launch, and then you look at colonizing a planet. We have the Artemis Accords, but is that going to extend to Mars? How? Have you thought about it?
So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because I find it super interesting. And what I'll try to say this quickly because we're tight on time here. But it's already hard to regulate Starlink. I think Brazil tried to ban Starlink or whatever, or something like this. But the satellites are in space, so you physically can't reach them or do anything about them. And then Mars, that's just a whole other level. So, laws only matter if they can be enforced. And the only way that laws will be enforced non-locally, so unless you're sitting there with your shotgun and you're defending your land, the only way that there will be repercussions are going to be reputational back on Earth, which will be dependent on who you represent. So if I go and I represent the UK, where I'm living now, Romania, where I was born, and I go and I steal something from the Chinese base, then maybe China will put sanctions on the UK, right? But in terms of actually enforcing laws, you can't until you've set up an economic base and there's a society there and there's a military and a way to enforce it. Up until that point, it will be like the Wild West out there, aside from the reputational repercussions back on Earth of who you represent.
Yeah. Well, you'll have legions of Optimi. So you never know. They might be the police force on Mars. I really appreciate you guys taking out the time. Thank you. And I hope we can get together as your model evolves. And then, we have a few more of these brainstorming chats. So thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Vlad. And Gustav, always a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. Hopefully we'll have you back again soon.
Really good to meet you guys. It was a pleasure. And see you next time.